Hello everybody and welcome back to the 7 County Witch Hunt Project podcast, a brief mini-series through the Folklore Podcast examining the research to come out of the 7 County Witch Hunt Project, hence the name. In the first episode you learned a little bit about the project itself, how the research was undertaken and the kinds of information that was being gathered and what we've learned about this particular period of witchcraft history. Today in episode 2 we're going to turn our attention to the actual accusations themselves and what the people who were termed witches or who are being termed witches through this project were actually accused of. Joining me again for this discussion are Professor Marion Gibson and Dr. Tabitha Stanmore. Welcome both.
Hello, thank you for having us again.
It's your project. It would be a very short discussion if you weren't here, to be fair. Okay, so we are interested today in the accusations, what we can learn from the historical record about the types of events which people were being accused of, magically or otherwise. Tabitha, did this throw up any surprises for you as you delved into the records?
Yes. So there were many things which were very predictable, sort of witchcraft activity. But then there were some stories which just didn't seem to fit anything that you might expect. So one of my favourites that I'm still not really sure what to do with is a woman named Joan Saunter, who was a woman living in a village called Streatham in Cambridgeshire. She was accused of witchcraft in 1647 by her stepson. And one of the main pieces of evidence he had against her was that apparently one day when he was walking back across the village green, he saw her travelling that way as well. And apparently a black horse appeared out of nowhere and crept betwixt her legs and then carried her off back to her home. And I don't know what he saw. And I really want to know how tall the horse was, how long her legs were.
I was going to ask this very question. Small horse, long legs?
I mean, it is in the fens, so one of the other things I thought might happen is that maybe the horse had fallen into a bog and just sort of like resurfaced underneath her. There are many options, but I'm not sure any of them actually explain what was happening in this particular case.
I love ones like that, where you think, could this actually happen? And you torment yourself for months about, is this a real event or is this just somebody's imagination? It's just brilliant, isn't it? It's kind of Uber horse that just shows up and takes you home when you want it. Oh my goodness.
So what about you, Marion? You were looking at Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex. In many people's minds, a hotbed of witchcraft activity in this particular period, perhaps rightly, perhaps wrongly. Maybe we'll come to that later. Anything surprising for you? Can you beat a tiny horse or a long-legged person?
No, I don't think I can actually.
Oh.
But I do have the story of a supposed witch who married the devil in church, which is just a fascinating thing. This is Ellen Driver, our old friend Ellen Driver, who we both, I think, become very interested in, who was from Framlingham in Suffolk. And she described how she'd met the devil many years before. She seems to have had a very long-term relationship with him, at least according to what poor Ellen confessed when she was confronted by Matthew Hopkins and other questioners. And she said that she had married the devil and that she'd done it in the church, presumably St Michael's Church in Framlingham, and that they'd had a couple of children together afterwards. She couldn't really explain what had happened to the children. She said that they'd been born and then they'd sort of gone away somewhere. So I don't know what this is. And again, a bit like Tabitha's story, I don't know how far to believe that this is a record of something that happened in Ellen's life, or whether it's completely imaginary in response to the fact that she's essentially being tortured. You know, she's being walked up and down, she's being kept awake, she's being questioned repeatedly, she's just falling in with somebody else's story. But I wonder how far this reflects, maybe she had children who died. So she did indeed give birth to children. We know she had at least one child, which is helpful. So she was a mother. Maybe the children died. Maybe she thought they were changelings or something like that. You know, they're kind of fairy children who were substituted for her real children and then were sort of mysteriously taken away from her. Maybe she was upset about something to do with her real life wedding. We know she was married too. Was it conducted under difficult circumstances? Was she maybe pregnant already? Did she have fears and guilt about her history of marriage and childbearing? Was it that? And it's just this amazing idea that she thought that she could confess to these people that she'd married the devil in their church. And that this was somehow fine. And then she said, bizarrely enough, also the devil died later, which again was not something that theologians would have gone along with. They thought the devil was this, immortal prince of the air and could not die. But her real life husband did die. So is that what she's talking about?
This is something I wonder quite a lot, actually. Often when the devil does appear and he's, lays heavily on her and that kind of thing, are we just talking about domestic violence cases?
No.
Is it that straightforward?
Yeah. Did she think her husband was the devil, in a sense? Mm-hmm. Maybe he was. Maybe he was. He goes off to the war partway through their relationship, and you get the sense that he's being pushed out of his community by other people. There's somebody who's literally deputed to take him to the front and give him all the equipment he needs to go to war. So you do get the sense that maybe he's somehow undesirable.
Well, we have, in the folklore record, certainly we have these stories as well which relate back ultimately to things like unwanted pregnancies or misdemeanours on the parts of the gentry over servants, or priests and clergymen over parishioners and things like that. And there's this kind of scapegoating element. But perhaps instead of scapegoating the woman as a witch in these stories, we're scapegoating the person inflicting whatever is happening and making them into a supernatural being or something else. It's an interesting dilemma, isn't it, when you look at these kinds of more unusual stories as to what's actually happening. What you're talking about puts me in mind of research as well, like Emma Wilby's work on Isabel Gowdy and those cases, for example, where you have sort of increasingly more unusual confessions as to what's happening, and how much of these are imaginary, how much of them are exaggerated ordinary life events, and how much of them are something else. And the dilemma then exists between somebody like me as a folklorist who looks at these things and goes, well, the actual truth behind it doesn't matter so much as the reasoning behind why somebody is saying that this did or didn't happen. And yourselves as historians who are perhaps looking at it from a slightly different approach. And how do we reconcile those two approaches through a project like this?
It's great, isn't it, to have this interdisciplinary sense of the project. Yeah. And I do have this kind of commitment, I suppose, to trying to get at the truth. But I also have a lot of scruples about what I think that truth might be and how easy it might be to determine it when you're faced with a range of sources, some of which are clearly fantastical and could not possibly have happened, some of which are horribly prejudiced against the people that they are describing and literally are demonising them and wanting to kill them as witches. Some of which are missing, there are no sources. We can't tell what happened in a community. Some of which are deeply ambiguous. Or we might be over-reading them. How much can you actually learn about a person's, entire marital and sexual history from knowing which fields they owned, for example? It's great, but it doesn't actually tell you what really happened, does it? So yes, I suppose I am committed to trying to reconstruct a truth, but I'm also very well aware that it is still an imagined truth, and that actually what matters in a sense is the story which it's become, which is the powerful thing that ultimately will decide whether somebody's condemned to death or not.
Yeah, I mean,
they shrunk collectively.
Well, and just to add an extra layer of problem to that is that it could well be true to one person in the room, but not to another. Yes. I mean, it could be absolutely true for Matthew Hopkins, who is pushing a particular narrative, and he might well believe potentially what's being said, or what's coming out of the accused mouth, or it might be a complete hokum to him, but it could actually be very true to her. It's sort of this. So even if we could access the truth, it's only one truth, even within that single situation. So
I've been thinking about descriptions of familiars as they appear. So when people were being watched and walked, as witches, essentially being tortured. The point of that was to make their familiars come to them and suckle on them or hold a conversation with them so that everybody would be able to see the familiars, and then they'd be able to say, well, she definitely is a witch because she's got these animal familiars. And the variety of accounts of people who are the watchers, who are sitting around in a group around the accused person, and say routinely, yeah, we did see this. We saw the black rabbit, we saw the greyhound that came to Elizabeth Clark, the famous familiar Vinegar Tom. Yeah, we saw him. And I have spent so long over the years thinking about what these people thought they saw. And there are accounts, there's one from a physician called Thomas Adey in the 1650s, and he tells the story of somebody who actually did an experiment with this, and a minister was thought that he knew about witches, he thought he knew about familiars, and the experimenter played a trick on him where he got somebody to hide under the bed and kind of ventriloquise the voices of the familiars. And the minister was absolutely convinced that there were familiars in the room and that this person was conjuring up demonic spirits right in front of him. And then he was told it's just a trick, so there's a boy under the bed and he's doing the voices. And he's embarrassed about himself, and he rethinks his beliefs, but he still says, but I saw the demonic ducks in the room. And I really wonder, I sometimes don't know how to tell those stories. I've rewritten the sentences about Elizabeth Clark's familiars in the book that I'm writing about this over and over again. And I still don't know what people thought they saw, or whether they really thought they saw it, or whether they're just listening to Elizabeth saying, oh, there's a greyhound come now, and he's called Vinegar Tom, and he's saying to me that I need to do this, or he's, and there's this black rabbit, and now he's coming in. Are they just listening to what she's saying inside her head? What does she believe about it? Or do they think that they really see something in the kind of dark corners of the room?
We'll turn our attention back to familiars later on in this series, in the fourth episode, when we look at witchcraft within families, and perhaps from a point of view that people don't normally associate with familiars, who are generally, in most people's minds, animals. And there are other aspects that we'll explore later on. But for now, let's turn our mind to the actual tangible things that people were accused of, perhaps, and to a certain degree try and pin down precisely what it was that people were having levelled against them. So tell us a little bit about the main activities that came up from the records that people were accused of in these cases.
Okay, so something you should know about me, I really love a spreadsheet, a lot. So I've put all of the people that we know were accused of witchcraft into a lovely spreadsheet, along with all the people who accused them. And I've sort of totted up the things that the witches were being accused of, and sort of counted them. I won't give you the numbers because it's quite boring, but I can tell you the top 5 things that these people were being accused of. And they are, as we said in the first episode, actually, very, very tied into diabolism. So the main things are having witches' marks, searching the witches' bodies was a very big part of these trials. And so finding witches' marks was one of the strongest pieces of evidence against many of the people. So that turns up a lot. Having familiars is another big one, again, possibly because of the methods used. Selling one's soul to the devil, unsurprisingly, often because there is a familiar involved, and that clearly sort of signifies a pact, or the fact that the witches' marks are there again suggests that there is, the devil has been covenanted with. And then it is harming people, often sending familiars to harm or kill somebody. Often the familiars don't seem to be particularly successful at killing adult men, but they are very successful at driving women mad and killing children, by the looks of it. And destruction of property is the final one, or spoiling food as well. And those seem to be the ones that come up again and again and again. And obviously every case is different. There are often extra elements or sort of bits put into it. But those seem to be common features that turn up in pretty much every, not all of them, but most of these trials, which again suggests something about the priorities involved, and potentially what the communities were afraid of, but definitely what Hopkins and Stern were looking for I don't know if you agree with that, Marion.
I do agree with all of that. Yeah, that makes complete sense. And it's a really interesting range of accusations, isn't it? On the one hand, quite practical stuff like spoiling food. On the other hand, highly unusual stuff like selling one's soul to the devil. There's a real range between sort of spiritual and the material there, and I think it helps to sum up really nicely what people thought witches were. They were ordinary enemies, bad neighbours, but they were also these astonishingly powerful spiritual enemies, heretics and devil worshippers.
To what extent do you think the kinds of activities that take place day to day in a location, and you're looking at different counties here, kind of reflect on these accusations? So, for example, here in Devon, where we are now, there's a big farming agriculture background, even more so historically than there is now, perhaps. And so we find a lot of the things that people are being accused of relating to that. A lot of the research that I've been doing into witchcraft in this county, for example, it's hard to find anybody who hasn't had a pig bewitched at one point or another. It seems to be something about bewitching pigs more than any other animal as well. That's a different conversation, I think. But so a lot of it relates to that. Churning butter failing, things like that. Things that you rely on for your trade not working for whatever reason, leads to an accusation like that. Do you find similar patterns across the counties that you've been exploring as well?
I think I would if there was more detail of the accusations sometimes. Okay. I've been quite frustrated in some of the places. I've looked at Great Yarmouth, for example, where the big issue in the mid-17th century is the fishing fleet. The entire town is reliant on the herring fishery. And it all goes horribly wrong in the middle of the Civil War. Pirates keep coming down on the herring fleets. Royalist privateers come and attack them and carry the boats off. The whole fishery is massively disrupted. And I was really hoping that I would find people who were accused of crimes related to the sea or to fish processing, that sort of thing. But there are no details of the accusations on the whole. There is one about the knitting industry, which was really important there. So somebody who fell out with her employer, essentially. She's employed as a piecework worker, so she's paid for the amount of knitted stockings, in this case, that she produces. And she's not being given extra work, so he's not finding the hours to give her so that she can sustain herself. And she falls out with him and supposedly bewitches her child. And when you get something like that, it's just gold dust, because you think, oh yes, this is a really local example of something that is an absolutely staple local industry being disrupted supposedly by witchcraft. But they are quite rare. I mean, you will find along the Essex coast, for example, and the Suffolk coast, people who are accused of attacking mariners, and that's always helpful. The clergyman John Lowes, who is accused there, says that he sunk a ship and that he's attacked people, and he really doesn't care about whether they're drowned or not. And I think that's really interesting. But sometimes there just isn't the detail where you can say, oh, this is a very localised type of accusation. The farming ones are really, really common, aren't they? So yeah, it's so often pigs and cows and milk and cheese and butter and beer. And they're just these kind of absolute staples that everybody has in every community. And a lot of witchcraft accusations relate to that. But I do sometimes wish that people had recorded more about what they're accusing people of.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's often, as you say, like pigs, cows, horses are the main sort of livestock which are being attacked in Cambridgeshire and Huntingdonshire at least. I have found a couple of examples of boats being sabotaged by magic, which I think relates to the fact that the Fens was largely navigable by boat, and so like it's a very good way of sabotaging your neighbour if that's what you want to do. So you do get those sort of local flavours sometimes, and I think that potentially the focus on cattle, especially in Cambridgeshire, could be to do with the fact that the area is being enclosed at the time, and so you have more private landowners driving cattle onto what was formerly common land. So the fact that the cattle are dying in quite large numbers might be something to do with either actual sabotage that is happening, as a result of the enclosure, or because there's more cattle available at that point than there was before. But yeah, it's strange actually, as you say, how much we do get those sort of repeat expectations of what witches will do. Yeah, it's strange.
So a lot of these accusations are born out of tension, born out of anxiety in different ways. And we spoke a little bit in the first episode about political tensions and about community tensions and things like that. So focusing more on the accusations themselves, where do we find these particular anxieties coming from? What concerns are they reflecting?
Oh, it's messy. I think, would you agree? I think it's messy.
Oh, it's messy.
Yeah. I think, so obviously history is sometimes divided into history from above and history from below, and kind of looking at sort of the priorities and anxieties of both kind of the elite and their sort of big theoretical ideas of how magic and witchcraft works, and then you've got sort of the more practical everyday sort of like, well, you know, I'm worried about somebody sabotaging my cow. And I think you definitely see that dynamic coming through in these trials to an extent. The concern about diabolism, that is very traditionally a kind of an elite thing to be worrying about, and the killing of cattle, and I've got some examples of things like mills falling down, or, you know, sort of ships being sunk and that kind of thing. And they seem much more sort of everyday, to do with, you know, the community and its own strife. I think by the time you get to 1640s, though, that idea is the elite ideas are so well established within society that those boundaries are being broken down a bit. You know, we were talking last episode about the impact of the Civil War and the fact that, you know, the idea of the devil walking abroad is something which is very present in everybody's mind. So I think you've got sort of national and local anxieties coming through in these trials a lot.
That makes sense to me. I'm also interested in the idea of anxiety generally, actually, because sometimes, like with the case of the people in Great Yarmouth, I wonder if the thing they're really anxious about is the thing they don't talk about. And that's the herring industry, and everybody knows. Everybody in the town knows. The magistrates know, the accusers know, the accused knows. This is the massive problem. You know, it's like if you lived in a town in the 1980s and your steelworks or your mine was closing. Did you talk about it all the time? You probably didn't. Maybe you talked about other things, and that was what became the meat and drink of accusations. So I wonder how far, when we find a silence about something, that's also an indicator of anxiety, but of course it's impossible to prove that. You can't actually say that that is so. All you can do is look at what the other records in the town are talking about, and then look at the witchcraft records and think, but this isn't present here. Why isn't it present here? It's sort of evidence of absence, if you like, but what kind of evidence is it?
Yeah, and it's very difficult to pin any of that stuff down, isn't it? Let's go off at a slight tangent for a moment, because the subject has come up a number of times already, and that's the subject of diabolism in these accusations. And yet we haven't really spoken about the role of the church at all. So I just wanted to touch on that whilst we're speaking about diabolism, because that's where you would expect a lot of this to come from, because the church at that time was very much a kind of fire and brimstone style of preaching, and the role of the devil is very hard and fast in that. Does the church figure much at all in the kinds of cases that you've been looking at, or is it more this tension between the elite and the common folk and the political tensions and those sorts of things, and is the religious aspect of it actually sidelined a bit?
It's a really interesting question. The church doesn't seem to be as present as, again, you might expect. It's not mentioned so much in the trials, and you don't get many priests giving testimony or anything like that, which I, again, might have expected. I think Peter Elmer argued quite a while ago now that that religion was a factor, but it wasn't that, for example, people of the godly sort, you know, the Puritans, were targeting people who were Catholic or sort of had those kind of high church leanings, but rather it varied according to community. So if you had a community that had a majority godly Puritan population, then the people who were accused of witchcraft were more likely to have sort of high church leanings. Whereas if you had a community which was much more sort of royalist or kind of Catholic leaning, then they would be targeting the more puritanical as potential witchy people. And I think that might, he's done a lot more research into that particular aspect than I have, but I think he might have a point there, because there is the idea that the devil is living in your community, it will always be the person that you're not, right, that is the one who's in league with the devil. So I think in that sense, it probably does factor quite a lot, or at least religion factors in quite a lot. But
no, I agree with that. I know, and Peter's work has been so helpful in putting this project together. He did a lot of work on many of these communities, trying to reconstruct the kind of religious temperature, if you like, of all of these places. I think in Essex and Suffolk, I think it's probably a lot more significant than maybe it is in other places, possibly in Norfolk as well, because Great Yarmouth is very, very divided on the religious front. And you can find clear evidence, for example, in Manningtree in Essex and Lawford in Essex, of religious dissent, religious groups fighting each other, a vacuum at the heart of those communities, where in one case the rector has left, and he's left this enormous gap in the community. Nobody is appointed to replace him. So there's this huge hole at the centre of their religious culture. And then in Lawford, you have a very proactive, godly vicar, John Eads, who really actually questions the people involved. I think puts a lot of the ideas and a lot of the energy into the witch hunt that then rolls out beyond Essex. He's really interested in diabolism, and the people he questions come out with these amazing stories of anti-Christian sectarian worship and literally church services that they've attended with their demonic familiars. So I think in that community it's really powerful. And again, in Great Yarmouth, you get ministers involved. The local council, if you like, delegates to its team of ministers some of the questioning of the accused people, and they get involved in the trial. And they're clearly involved in a long-term battle with equally godly but sectarianly different competitors, if you like. So there are two religious factions within the town that are kind of fighting it out, and the place they're fighting it out is the witchcraft trial in the court. So I think that's really important in that case. But in other cases, it's harder to tell. And in Suffolk, of course, you actually get a clergyman accused and executed as a witch, John Lowes in Brandeston. And therefore, religion has to be central to that. But also, he seems, people make accusations about, we think he's some kind of heretic, his beliefs are very unusual. We don't even really want to talk about them. He seems to have varied from being a very godly young man who went to sermon exercises and interacted with other godly ministers in Bury St Edmunds, his big local town, to somebody who might possibly have had more kind of high church royalist sympathies later in his life. It's hard to tell, but he seems very inconsistent religiously, and people certainly portray him very differently religiously. But he was also clearly a very obstreperous and litigious man, and maybe that's more important for his neighbours, because he's always going after them about one thing or another and falling out with them, and maybe that's why they accuse him. So I think it's really important. I think in the communities of the East Coast, I think it is particularly important. There's probably religious influence coming in from abroad. People are distributing uber Protestant tracts in these localities, and I think there's more interest in sectarian conflict there. But it may be that in the Midlands and in other places that isn't quite so prevalent. Each community is different. Peter was absolutely right.
But we do find these crossovers between religion and magic anyway, of course, in the historical record, particularly down here in the southwest, when you look at the number of what we describe as conjuring parsons and those kinds of clergymen who are using practical magic, the kind of work that you look at, Tabitha, as part of their everyday lives. They preach a sermon on a Sunday, but then they cast your horoscope in the evening or whatever. So there is that kind of crossover there as well.
There is.
You find that across the board?
Yes, John Lowes was one of those. Yeah. He used a charm on a neighbour's child. He hung a golden necklace around this little boy's neck. and the child, amended and got better. And you think, aha, he's one of those. But you also think, but wait, how can he be a godly clergyman on the one hand who goes to Puritan exercises and gives competitive sermons, and on the other hand, later in his life, he's actually dishing out charms to his parishioners, and he seems to be presenting himself as some sort of healer. They talk about him as somebody who actually makes patients worse rather than better, and that's one of the reasons why they start to suspect he's a witch.
But then the other way round, when we look at cunning folk, though, how many of those charms are being given out by cunning folk who are good God-fearing Christians at the end of the day, or how many psalms are used as parts of those charms, and the boundaries blur, don't they, all the time?
Very much, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look at these particular accusations, and we know what sorts of things people are being accused of, but where are those accusations coming from? Are they coming from within the community? Are Hopkins and Stern, as the hunters of witches, driving those accusations? Are they telling people what they should be saying, or is this coming out of the community alone and they're jumping on it? How does it all work?
Yeah, I think it's both. I don't think the witch hunt could possibly have happened in the way that it did if it were not for a very high level of suspicion in the communities that the witch finders visit. There are clearly, we talked about this in the first episode, there are festering resentments in these communities which have been going on for decades, and people will often date back their first encounter with supposedly hostile witches a couple of decades, or 5-6 years, something like that. So clearly people are keen to accuse their neighbours of witchcraft, and what the witchfinders offer them is an opportunity to do that. But I think once the witchfinders have the suspect in front of them and they are abusing them in the way that they very frequently did, that therefore they are pushing them towards a certain conformity with the kind of story they are looking for. And I think this is why you get such a high incidence of accusations of devil worship and having demonic marks and so on. It may be that people in the communities already thought that that was what witchcraft was and that was what their neighbours were up to. But when Hopkins and Stern show up, there's a real uniformity in the stories. And occasionally you'll even get something in a community where somebody is clearly parroting something that Hopkins and Stern, have already discovered in another community. So somebody gives the names of their familiars in Essex. And then funnily enough, the same names of the familiars, which are really unusual, things like Grizzle, Greedy Cut and so on, they turn up in Huntingdonshire. And you think, aha! I can see that there's a chain of evidence there where I think the carrier of that particular belief is Matthew Hopkins or John Stern, and they are getting the suspects to confess particular details of what they've been up to. They're transmitting these beliefs from one community to another, so therefore they are the drivers in that instance.
Yeah, I think that's especially true of the witches' marks. I've noticed in the cases that I've been looking at least, that no member of the community comes forward and says, I know this person's a witch because I've seen their witch's mark. That's always something that comes out as a result of the investigation. And as the idea of witches' marks sort of grows, the news of Hopkins and Stern looking for these sort of spreads and actually precedes them. So then in Cambridgeshire, which I think is one of the last counties that they visited, you have examples of women and men cutting off their skin abnormalities to avoid being seen as a witch. And that's not something that they thought they should deal with beforehand. That's not something that they've been been ousted for in their communities for decades before this. This is something which has been introduced to the witchcraft idea as a result of these particular trials. So I think that's definitely sort of from them. But again, sometimes you also see in the confessions and the accusations very, very local concerns. And sometimes they're clearly not what Hopkins and Stern want to hear. So there's the case of Margaret Moore, who, in the trial record, she basically goes into a lot of detail about how she sold her soul to the devil because she wanted to save her child's life. And we'll talk more about that case in a future episode, I hope, because it's fantastic. Heartbreakingly sad, but fascinating. But when you look at Hopkins's discovery of witches, the description of what happened to Margaret Moore and why she sold her soul to the devil is because she was annoyed that she hadn't been given the pig that she bought. So he completely cuts out the main reason, her rationale for why she was, involved in diabolism, and instead kind of inserts this other sort of much more pithy, stereotypical story that is clearly not what was her priority when she was confessing. So it can't all be stuff that is being put into their mouths because they've got their own stories they do want to tell.
So part of the reason for this project and part of the reason for this series is to enrich our understanding of this particular period of history and of these cases and these accusations. And I think as we're working through this, we're doing that by expanding upon the body of knowledge that we have, for sure. So I just want to wrap this one up by asking whether we need to change people's understandings of Matthew Hopkins and John Stern as individuals, because the picture is painted of Hopkins particularly. He seems to be the poster boy of witch hunting for whatever reason, and everybody's views are basically all of these accusations, all of these problems, all of these executions are down to Matthew Hopkins. Full stop. That's it. It's all him. Is that actually the case?
No. So there we go. Yes, and why? Justify your answer.
Yes.
No, absolutely not. And one of the temptations that I tried to resist in the early days of putting together the project was to refer to this as the Hopkins witch hunt, because that's so often how people refer to it. And it's not all about him. I think, there's kind of historical reality where it's not about him, and there's also the kind of ethical imperative where it is not about him. It's about the accused people and their experience and their stories. So I have tried wherever possible to marginalise him. He did have redeeming features. He was very, very young. He was in his mid-20s. He was probably really ill. He certainly died in 1647 before he'd really had the opportunity to continue the hunt that he'd wanted. I suspect this is a very young, sick man who is obsessed with conspiracy theories, who is misogynistic, who is deeply confused and anxious and probably concerned about his own place in the world, whether he's going to heaven or hell, which he's going to arrive at pretty soon. So from that point of view, he's a human being, but he's deeply repellent human being. And I really want to decenter him from this hunt and make this about other people, actually. And I think this is one of the ways that we can do this, by enriching their stories and by telling their stories and concentrating on what they were talking about in their communities before Hopkins and his sidekick Stern roll up.
Marion, Tabitha, thank you both very much. You've expanded everybody's understanding, I think, of the accusations themselves and what was being levelled against these individuals. In the next episode of this series, we'll turn our attention to one of the biggest stereotypes surrounding witchcraft histories, that of gender. Whether all of these accusations were being levelled against women of a certain class, or is it broader than that? So, in episode 3, we will unpick the thorny stereotype of gender and witchcraft. I hope you can all join us for that. Thank you.